In our previous lecture, we had discussed World War II, the war unleashed by Hitler as a way station onto the realization of his ultimate goals. In this lecture, we'll examine in detail Nazi genocide and future master plans. We'll consider the Nazis' program of mass murder against the Jews and Hitler's future plans for the construction of a racial utopia. The Nazis set off on the road to mass murder with escalating persecutions, with medical killing, and then with execution squads sent into occupied countries. These programs would lead to the construction of those institutions, the factories of death, the extermination camps of Eastern Europe during World War II. For the future, Hitler and the Nazis looked forward to a colonial utopia in the East. Nazi architecture and monuments would suggest the vast scale of Hitler's ambitions, and only the end of the Second World War in 1945 and the defeat of Germany would bring these plans and their megalomania to an end. The Nazis had been quite explicit about their goals of achieving a racial utopia. Now, within German society at this period, a joke circulated which cast doubt on the validity of this racial aim. The joke went as follows: what should an ideal German look like? A representative of Hitler's planned Aryan future race. The joke said, with conscious irony and paradox, that the ideal German should be as blonde as Hitler, who in fact had dark hair, as slim as Goering, the notoriously fat fighter ace and Nazi leader, as tall as Goebbels, who was in fact diminutive, and as chaste as Röhm, the stormtrooper who had decidedly not been so. But in fact, this joke, while it certainly stripped away the veneer of ideological hypocrisy in these leaders presenting themselves as model Germans, in terms of their own racial criteria, the Nazis would have responded by arguing that they in fact were in the process of reshaping the raw material of the German people, unsatisfactory as it might be at present by their standards, on the road to creating or breeding the master race of the future. And this program, this impetus, this dreadful dynamism would lead to murder as a tool in the realization of these utopian nightmares. The road to murder led, first of all, through eugenics. Eugenic thinking was, in fact, not a German monopoly. We've discussed it in an earlier lecture. It had been a mode of thinking remarkably widespread worldwide during the first half of the century. This mode of thought, often associated with social Darwinism, had urged social policies that would plan a superior population for the nation through the encouraging of good births, as they were called, and discouraging, as the flip side, the reproduction of those who were judged unfit. German eugenics was not initiated only by Nazi medical experts, but in fact had a strong tradition in Germany long before 1933. It's also a dreadful commentary that American eugenics measures, and in particular the forced sterilization laws that were common to many American states before in the 1930s, were often held up by German eugenicists as a model, an inspiration for their own movement. The existence of such laws is something that I think has been largely suppressed from the collective memory in the United States, but deserves to be recalled. The Nazis would make eugenic policy one of their key notes. Soon after coming to office, the Nazis passed a law in July of 1933 which authorized the forced involuntary sterilization of those with hereditary diseases. Those could include mental illness, epilepsy, blindness, or alcoholism, which was judged to have a genetic basis. Hundreds of thousands of Germans were sterilized involuntarily. Nazi education, preparing the way for even more radical policies in the future, sought energetically to propagate eugenic thinking in the younger generation, with readings or math word problems about the social costs of what were considered those who were unfit. in the Nazi genius for perverting the German language for their ideological aims. New phrases, new terms, new names were crafted to label those who were considered unfit. And these were chilling terms. They included the term nutzlose Fresser, useless eaters, or lebensunwertes Leben, life unworthy of living. And Nazi doctors would decide who was worthy of living and who was not. The policy that next came into being was the euthanasia policy. In 1939, a program of euthanasia, or so-called mercy killing, was instituted in Germany, secretly, using the Second World War as a cover to justify these measures. We need for a moment to look back to the phenomenon of the First World War and some of its devaluation of human life to see that there were in fact earlier precedents for such a policy. It is now emerging in current research that's being done on German asylums and hospitals in the period of the First World War that what amounted to a policy of euthanasia was perhaps, the historical record is now in the process of being researched more carefully, but perhaps there were policies that amounted to passive euthanasia, as those who were considered mentally ill or were physically unfit were considered less deserving of limited food resources in a time of total war and limited resources in the First World War. Some historians are arguing, and the research is still ongoing, that this experience of the First World War in some sense informed and prepared the way for active euthanasia in the Nazi regime during World War II. The Nazis now set about an active program of killing of those whom they considered to be a drag on the national unity and resources. Departments and hospitals were ordered to collect information on children and then on adults who had handicaps or mental illness, and those who were so referred were passed into the hands of SS experts who would, in essence, condemn them to death. An estimated 100,000 people were killed in the course of this program of euthanasia. The program was then halted precipitately in August of 1941 for reasons that are still being debated by historians. Some argue that the very beginnings of growing resistance and unease on the part of some in German society who objected to euthanasia were instrumental in bringing the program to a halt. Other historians have argued that, in fact, a simpler bureaucratic feature was at work. The euthanasia program had killed as many people as they had planned to kill initially, and thus was halted for the time being. An institution that would play a very important role in now stepping into the forefront and executing the racial plans of the Nazi regime was the SS under Heinrich Himmler. It was to be a key institution in the Third Reich's racial policies. SS medical personnel had been involved in the euthanasia program, where many of them had gained experience in the business of scientific, medicalized mass murder. The Reichsführer SS, Heinrich Himmler, now sought to craft within the SS a new racial elite devoted to the breeding of a master race. In 1939, he became Commissar for the Strengthening of Germandom, a title which in essence gave him enormous powers in the occupied Eastern territories to seek to realize the racial utopia. Under Himmler's deputy, Reinhard Heydrich, the SS pressed forward with a policy of, and this was a consciously ugly word in German society, a policy of Entjudung, the removal of the Jews from Germany. By 1939, more than a fourth of all German Jews had emigrated. Those who were left were those who could often not find refuge elsewhere in the world, the most vulnerable in society, who awaited their fate. The SS also provided master experienced executioners, the Einsatzgruppen, the special forces task groups or strike groups of the SS, who were at first in 1939 sent into Poland to eliminate intellectuals and leaders and to quell potential resistance. They and other Nazi officials then set about also deporting tens of thousands of Polish Jews from those areas in Western Poland that were to be annexed to the Greater German Reich. Those tens of thousands of Polish Jews were now essentially expelled into the remaining areas of occupied Poland, which the regime planned to use as a so-called dumping ground or reservation for Jews and others who were considered racially undesirable. The areas otherwise in Nazi influence were to be cleansed of Jews. With the attack on the Soviet Union, the Einsatzgruppen followed right behind the German armies as the front moved forward. And behind the lines, they committed mass murder of the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe, killing an estimated 1 million Jews by the end of 1941. However, Nazi leaders judged that this mode of killing, the open executions, the shooting into pits of men, women, and children in the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe by the Einsatzgruppen, was too open, too inefficient in essence. Anxieties were voiced about what effect this face-to-face killing would have even on ideologically motivated killers like the Einsatzgruppen. Heinrich Himmler, who witnessed an execution, apparently fainted on viewing its barbarity not from behind a desk but face-to-face. Thus, new plans were laid for a more efficient, more regularized, more bureaucratic plan. And this was known as the final solution, using the Nazis' perverse talent for bureaucratic euphemism. The final solution was to eliminate the Jews. The Wannsee Conference, as it was called, took place on January 20th, 1942, in an opulent villa outside of Berlin. There's a remarkable museum there today. It's a place around which, in our historical memory, an aura of evil hovers. Because in this villa, even as operations were already underway, even as the final solution was being put into effect, discussions took place on how to systematize the comprehensive final solution. The final solution, contrary to much popular memory that circulates out there, was not planned at the Wannsee Villa. Rather, the discussion wasn't about whether the program should take place, but merely about how to fine-tune it. When the meeting protocol, when the minutes of the meeting, couched in bureaucratic euphemism, in an attempt to cloud or veil as much as was possible the reality of what was being discussed, mass murder, when these minutes were discovered after the war with justice, they were called some of the most shameful documents in world history. What had been agreed? Europe's Jews, not just in Germany or in Poland, but from all of Europe, already occupied or yet to be occupied, were to be, in a euphemism, shipped to the East. There they'd be worked to death or exterminated outright. Within Germany itself, the obligatory Yellow Star was introduced for German Jews in 1941, which had already taken place in other occupied territories in Eastern Europe, and thus this community was now singled out, set apart for this fate. Hitler's role in the launching of the Nazi genocide is still being debated as historians trace his precise actions in the available documentation. Hitler's aversion both to regular bureaucratic functioning as well as putting orders down on paper, written orders, his caution about leaving a paper trail that could be traced back to him makes tracing the documentary evidence complicated. But clearly, Hitler's role was pivotal, as he established the long-term goals of the regime and endorsed programs of growing radicalism in the racial sphere. But one needs to keep in mind the larger circle of complicity around Hitler as well. It's crucial to note that a program of this scope and this magnitude, involving the planned murder of millions, involved more than just Hitler himself, more than a small circle of planners, such as at Wannsee, but that in fact, enormous numbers of officials at the highest and the lowest levels of the state and the party, from generals to mayors of towns, to station masters, to ordinary guards, were implicated and were needed to make the final solution happen. And indeed, wherever the Nazis gained power in the occupied countries of Europe, they found collaborators who turned up in every country to help them in this program. The program culminated in the erection of what were essentially factories of death, institutions, the death camps, that produced not goods, not material, but death itself. By early 1942, death camps were operating under SS control in the occupied Eastern territories, with names that still ring with horror for us today. names like Auschwitz, Belzec, Treblinka, Chelmno, Majdanek, and Sobibor. These were, as distinct from the earlier concentration camps, devoted to the extermination of those who were sent there. Europe's Jews were concentrated in ghettos, in Poland and elsewhere, and then were shipped to the camps by train. Gas chambers were disguised as showers and were used to kill millions in a rationalized machinery of death. Unlike in earlier concentration camps set up in the first years of the Nazi regime where where their existence was relatively open, here secrecy was emphasized to avoid news spreading that might affect neutral world opinion, to avoid news spreading to the German home front, which then would be confronted with the immediate reality of what was being done in Germany's name, and to prevent provoking more desperate resistance among intended victims. Yet one thing is clear. In spite of the sort of secrecy that was ordered, such a program couldn't be kept entirely secret. Millions of Germans and others were involved, directly or indirectly, and thus had some measure of knowledge about the program's details. There was a further irony. When news of death camps did leak out of Germany and the occupied territories to the west, those rumors were often initially not believed. This was another legacy of the First World War. Propaganda in the First World War had announced news of atrocities, some without basis, some with basis. And after the First World War, a great skepticism had grown up about such stories. It was precisely this skepticism which in this case led to such true rumors, such first portents of the atrocities being committed by the Nazis in their full scale, led to them at first being dismissed. And the toll of such policies was dreadful. The Nazis killed an estimated 6 million Jews in their camps and elsewhere during the Holocaust, and they were further responsible for the deaths of millions of others due to abuse, slave labor, and executions. One Italian Jewish survivor of Auschwitz, Primo Levi, gave a searing account of his experiences in what amounts to a classic of this barbarous era, his book Survival in Auschwitz, which showed in detail from his own experiences how the camp universe, the parallel universe set up by the Nazis, was designed specifically for the aim of destroying human identity itself, demonstrating to the prisoners that there were no limits in how they might be treated, and to fulfill the ideological prophecies of the Nazis, who had announced that the world was broken down on racial lines, that some races would be slated for extinction while others dominated. The camps were where those prophecies were to be brought to pass, as Primo Levi suggested. Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz also had one haunting image. Primo Levi recounted an experience he had of a meeting with an educated German, a doctor by the name of Panwitz, who was looking for educated prisoners who knew something about chemistry in order to use their knowledge, at least for a while, to use them economically. Panwitz interviewed Primo Levi, and Primo Levi explained that if he were able, as a survivor of the camp, to communicate to people who had not known that reality, how that German doctor had looked at him, that look, that gaze, he could communicate the entire barbarity of Nazi Germany. He explained that that look was not the sort of look that would pass between two human beings. There was no flicker of fellow feeling, no recognition of common shared humanity on the part of that German doctor as he looked at the prisoner in front of him. Primo Levi explained that instead it was a sort of look that one might see at a zoo between a creature of one race and another who was there to be exploited, to be used and cast aside, not a fellow human being. Primo Levi understood that his very humanity was under assault. The Nazis had further future plans beyond even their barbaric perfection of the final solution. We need to discuss in brief some of the Nazi visions for the future, in essence, the science fiction of the Nazi utopia which they projected for the future. Hitler foresaw a Europe which would be dominated and organized by the Germans as a master race, spreading into the living spaces of Eastern Europe as colonial overlords. The German people were to grow from 80 million at present to 250 million in 1 century, and they were to be racially re-engineered. They were to be purified, the dross melted away, stripped away, and instead leaving the racially pure. The Third Reich was to last 1,000 years and to dominate world politics. In some sense, we don't need merely to look at Nazi propaganda to understand their plans for the future. We can actually view another document which gives us a glimpse of the future. This is the GPO, as it's known in its bureaucratic acronym, the General Plan for the East, Generalplan Ost. This was an actual blueprint of Nazi plans produced in the SS Planning Office for the future of Eastern Europe. It was reviewed by Heinrich Himmler in June of 1942, and it was sent back to the planning office by Himmler with a comment that it was still too gentle, still too mild. They should continue to work on it. What did this document say in that form? Well, it projected what Eastern Europe would look like 25 years after the war had been successfully fought by the Nazis. It was, in essence, a work of science fiction. It coolly calculated the removal and the annihilation of some 31 million non-Germans from Eastern Europe, the Slavic and non-German peoples living there now. Those who would be allowed to remain would not be free, rather they would provide slave labor for a while, and their areas would be colonized by the German master race. Now, these projects were already in part underway with a movement of ethnic Germans from Eastern European countries to the new colonial empire. Nazi architecture also gives us a vivid visual way of understanding some of the vastness of the regime's ambitions. The Nazis declared that their architecture was ideology in stone. It was bombastic, it was neoclassical, it expressed some of the compulsions of the Nazis for monumentality and the dwarfing of the individual. Hitler, who himself was a frustrated architect, compulsively planned and replanned the rebuilding of Berlin as a new German capital to be renamed Germania on a grand scale, with vast party buildings, vast parade grounds, assembly halls, and marching fields where 1 million Germans could gather to parade in the marching that was so important to Nazi imagery. These buildings were to be cultic centers, replacing traditional religion, which was expected to wither away. Hitler was especially pleased with the work of his personal architect, Albert Speer, who was charged with the mission of realizing some of Hitler's fantasies, who would achieve the so-called Cathedral of Light, a massive projection of pillars of light in the Nuremberg party rallies to imitate a traditional cathedral. The grandiosity of Nazi architectural plans has suggested to some historians larger aims, including world domination. Nazi architecture was pre-planned to leave tremendous dramatic ruins for the future, thousands of years hence. Some historians have argued that it's also a blueprint for world plans. And Hitler clearly had superpower visions. He envisioned a post-war order of large blocks of superpowers contending for supremacy, certainly Germany, maybe Great Britain, maybe the United States, maybe others. There is evidence of global goals in Nazi planning for such seemingly improbable things like an invasion of India in order to strike at the British Empire through Afghanistan, plans for super battleships and super bombers that would be capable of ranges to reach America in a coming war. Hitler's view of the United States was a very interesting feature of his thinking about the future. His views of Americans had always been very ambivalent. At certain times, they were largely negative. At certain times, though, Hitler had thought that the preponderance of German ancestry among many Americans might represent a racial core that meant that America might still be revived. At other times, he and the Nazis were scathing in considering America, as they put it, a mongrel nation of racial mixture and of mixing, which doomed it in racial terms in coming confrontations. Hitler seemed to expect a showdown between the German superpower and the United States, perhaps in another generation after his time. When it came to war, however, between Japan, his ally, and the United States, Hitler declared war on the U.S. on December 11th, 1941, after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, and cast the die in this gamble. The Second World War would also be brought to an end which would spell the conclusion to these bombastic plans. The battle over Stalingrad in the Soviet Union in late 1942 and 1943 had grown into an emblematic struggle between the dictators. It had enormous symbolic significance. In this sense, it bore some similarities both in the stakes as well as the ferocity of the fighting to that great industrial battle of Verdun that we've discussed in the First World War. Hitler had announced how important it was to take this city, Stalingrad, which literally means Stalinville, to show that Stalin's own city, Stalin's own place of honor, was not immune from German victories. When the German army there, however, was surrounded by the Red Army, Hitler would refuse to countenance the idea of a retreat. And when the German army surrendered there finally in January of 1943 against his orders, this marked a symbolic turning point of the war, because the veneer that had earlier surrounded supposedly inevitable victory of German forces in the field was now lost. The fortunes, the tides of war had begun to turn. This was clear in fascist Italy as well, which had increasingly come under the orbit of the Nazis. Benito Mussolini was deposed by some of his own fascist allies and was arrested in July of 1943, ending his domination of Italy. This fact in and of itself is significant. One can't imagine Hitler being deposed by some of his closest followers in this same way. Clearly, Benito Mussolini, though he was proud of being supposedly the archetypal totalitarian dictator, in fact had not achieved that measure of total control. Hitler, who felt that he would ever after owe Mussolini a debt of gratitude for showing the way in his political career, set special forces to rescue him from his captivity, and Mussolini was then finally set up to rule over a rump little puppet state in northern Italy, the Republic of Salo, where towards the end of his career, coming full circle almost, some have suggested, Benito Mussolini pursued more socialist policies, coming back to some of the affinities of his youth. Eventually, however, as Italy was itself lost to the Germans, as the Allies fought their way up the peninsula, Mussolini himself would be hunted down by partisans, killed, and ignominiously hung upside down, a bitter end for a man who had wrought such destruction in Italy. The war had turned against Germany in spite of the belated total mobilization of the economy, which Hitler had deferred out of fear for how the German home front might react. The Soviet army now advanced relentlessly on Germany and was joined in the West by American and British forces in 1944 as the noose tightened on Hitler's Third Reich. Goebbels, meanwhile, pulled off some remarkable propaganda stunts even as defeat grew near. Goebbels argued that Stalingrad's defeat should not be hidden from the German people, but should in fact be played up. Germans could be motivated to fight not through confidence in victory, he said, but even more effectively through fear. And he would now play masterfully upon the anxieties and the consciences of those who felt what retribution might be in store after the Nazis' reign of terror. Hitler now retreated to the bunker in Berlin, awaiting the end. In the bunker, underneath the center of Berlin, Hitler began to lose touch with reality. In the strange last days of Nazi Germany, Goebbels sought to produce a final triumph of propaganda, and this already suggested his own loss of reality, the way in which this propaganda chief had come to believe his own propaganda about the inevitable victory or the glory of the Third Reich. Goebbels sought to choreograph the fall of Berlin itself as a film which wasn't on film, but rather would be enacted with real actors, real fighters, real leaders going down in defeat. This was to be the final act in a Wagnerian opera made real, a twilight of the gods, as the final crowning element of the myth of the Führer that he had crafted. And he, after killing his children and his wife, would follow his Führer into death. With the so-called Nero Order of March 1945, Hitler, without a trace of remorse, ordered the destruction of Germany itself to be sure that the Allies would gain nothing after he was defeated. And after leaving a hate-filled final testament in which Hitler announced with no trace of remorse that his hatred would arise again, he committed suicide on April 30th, 1945, in the bunker. In Asia, Japan was defeated with a dropping of atomic bombs, opening the atomic age. What would follow upon the horrors of the Second World War, however, contemporaries would be horrified to discover, was not the hoped-for peace, but rather a new standoff, the ideological conflict of the Cold War, to be discussed in our next lecture.